They burned the books, every single one of them. In the year 1562, a Spanish priest named Diego de Landa stood in the middle of a Maya village in the Yucatan and ordered his soldiers to throw every manuscript, every carved stone record, every piece of written history into a giant fire. He watched them burn with his own eyes. He later wrote that the Maya people cried. They screamed. Some of them fainted from grief, because those were not just books. Those were thousands of years of memory, thousands of years of knowing exactly who they were and where they came from. And that priest smiled, because he thought he had erased them. But here is what Diego de Landa did not know. Here is the thing that would have terrified him more than any book. You cannot burn blood. You cannot throw DNA into a fire. You cannot colonize a chromosome. And 500 years later, a group of scientists sat inside a laboratory in the city of Mexico, looking at screens filled with genetic data, and they whispered to each other in disbelief. Because the blood of the Mexican people had been keeping secrets, enormous, ancient, world-changing secrets, and it was finally ready to speak. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear will make you question everything you were taught about one of the greatest civilizations in human history. And if this kind of story moves something inside you, if you believe that truth matters more than comfortable lies, then right now, before we go any further, hit that subscribe button. Because this channel exists for exactly this reason. To find the truth that was hidden. To hear the whisper of genes across thousands of years. Now, let us go back. Not 500 years, not 1,000 years. Let us go back to a time when Mexico did not exist, when the land itself was waiting. Picture a corridor, a long, brutal, magnificent corridor of mountains and deserts and jungles stretching from the frozen north all the way down to the steaming rainforests of the south. This was not just geography. This was a highway for the human species. For tens of thousands of years, waves of people walked through this corridor. They did not know they were making history. They were just following the animals, following the water, following survival. But every group that passed through left something behind. Not buildings, not languages, something smaller and far more permanent. They left their DNA inside the people who stayed. This is the paradox that will follow us through this entire story. The paradox of Mexico. On the surface, you see one identity, one flag, one language, one story of Aztec glory and Spanish conquest. But underneath the skin, inside every cell of every Mexican person alive today, there is a library. And that library contains chapters written in languages that died before the pyramids of Teotihuacan were even built. So who were the first authors of this story? The answer begins in a place called Beringia, a land bridge that no longer exists. More than 20,000 years ago, when the oceans were lower and the ice covered the north of the world, groups of humans crossed from what we now call Siberia into the American continent. These were not Aztecs. These were not Maya. These were small bands of hunter-gatherers who had no name for themselves because the concept of a nation had not yet been invented. They were simply human, hungry, brave, and completely unaware that they were about to inherit an entire hemisphere. These first arrivals spread slowly, and when scientists today extract DNA from ancient bones found in caves across Mexico, they find a genetic signal so deep and so pure that it makes the hair stand up on your arms. This signal is called the founding lineage of the Americas. And here's the first shock. It is not one single group. It is at least three distinct waves of migration. Three different populations. Three different genetic stories, all arriving at different times. All mixing together over thousands of years in the valleys and mountains of what would one day be called Mexico. And now we arrive at the first major conflict in this genetic detective story. For a long time, historians and archaeologists believed that the Aztecs, the people who built Tenochtitlan, the great city in the middle of the lake, were the original heart of Mexican civilization, the foundation, the root. But then the geneticists arrived, and they started asking a very different question. They did not ask who built the biggest temples. They asked something much more dangerous. They asked who was here before the builders, and the answer was devastating to the old story. Before the Aztecs, there was Teotihuacan, a city so enormous that at its peak, it was one of the largest cities on the entire planet. More than 100,000 people living in organized neighborhoods, with running water systems, apartment buildings, murals of breathtaking beauty. And nobody knows for certain who built it. The Aztecs themselves, when they arrived centuries later and found this city already ancient and empty and silent, were so overwhelmed that they gave it a name that meant the place where gods were born. They thought only gods could have created something so perfect, and they were terrified of it. Scientists took DNA samples from the ancient remains found buried beneath the floors of Teotihuacan, and what they discovered broke open the entire conversation about Mexican identity. The people of Teotihuacan were not the ancestors of the Aztecs in any simple straight line. They were something older, something that connected back to those earliest founding lineages, yes, but also showed signs of contact and mixture with populations from the south, from the Gulf Coast, from regions that would later produce the Olmec, the culture that many geneticists and archaeologists now call the mother of all Mesoamerican civilizations. The Olmec. Say that name slowly, because most people outside of academic circles have never heard of them, and that is a crime against history. The Olmec existed more than 3,000 years ago. They carved giant stone heads, some weighing more than 40 tons, with faces that looked nothing like the stereotypical image of a pre-Columbian American. Broad features, powerful expressions, and they built the first complex society in Mesoamerica. They invented a calendar system. They developed the earliest known writing in the Western Hemisphere. They created the concept of the ball game that would spread across every major civilization that came after them. And then, like a candle in a storm, they vanished. Their cities were buried. Their people scattered. But did they really vanish? Or did they simply dissolve into the blood of the people who came after them? This is where the genetic detective puts on the coat and walks into the cold rain of history. Because when researchers analyze the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material that passes from mother to child in an unbroken line across thousands of years, they find something extraordinary in modern Mexican populations. Maternal lineages that trace back not to the Aztec migration from the north, not to the Spanish conquest from the east, but to populations that were already established in the heart of Mesoamerica long before any of the famous civilizations rose to power. These are the genetic echoes of people whose names we do not know, whose language we cannot speak, but whose blood never left. Think about that for a moment. The genetic foundation of the Mexican people, the deepest layer, the bedrock upon which everything else was built, belongs to people who were farming and building and dreaming in this land while Europe was still in the Bronze Age. While the pyramids of Egypt were being planned. This is not a small detail. This is the entire story. And now we need to talk about the Y chromosome. Because while the mothers kept the old blood alive, the fathers tell a completely different and far more violent story. The Y chromosome passes from father to son, unchanged, unbroken, like a surname written in biological ink. And when scientists mapped the Y chromosome haplogroups of modern Mexican men, they expected to find a straightforward picture. Indigenous American lineages from the pre-conquest period, mixed with European lineages from the Spanish colonial period. Simple, clean, the textbook version. But genetics is never simple, and history is never clean. What they found instead was a catastrophe written in DNA. The indigenous male lineages, the Y chromosomes that would have carried the genetic signature of Aztec warriors, Maya kings, Olmec priests, and 1,000 other unnamed fathers across 20,000 years of American history, had been almost completely replaced. Not mixed, not diluted, replaced. The Spanish conquest was not just a political event, it was a genetic earthquake. The male lines of indigenous Mexico were shattered, broken by war, by disease, by forced labor, by the systematic destruction of entire communities. In some regions of modern Mexico, researchers found that more than 90% of male lineages trace back to European origin. 90%. That number should stop you cold, because it means that the men who built Tenochtitlan, the men who performed the ceremonies at Chichen Itza, the men who traded cacao and jade across a network of cities stretching thousands of miles, their direct male descendants are almost invisible in the modern genetic record. But the mothers survived. And this is where the story transforms from tragedy into something almost miraculous. Because the mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, tells a completely opposite story. In those same Mexican populations where 90% of male lines are European, more than 80% of female lines remain indigenous American. The women of Mexico carried the ancient blood forward. Through every generation of colonial violence, through every attempt to erase and replace and rewrite, the mothers held the genetic memory of 20,000 years inside their bodies and passed it to their children. This phenomenon has a name in genetics. Scientists call it asymmetric admixture. But that is a cold and clinical term for something that is actually one of the most dramatic stories of survival in human history. The women did not choose this consciously. They did not know they were preserving a civilization in their DNA. They simply lived and loved and gave birth. And in doing so, they kept alive the deepest roots of one of the greatest cultures the world has ever produced. Now we need to ask the question that changes everything. If the blood is so deeply indigenous, if the maternal foundation of the Mexican people reaches back tens of thousands of years into the American continent, then why does the modern Mexican speak Spanish? Why does the culture look so European on the surface? Why did the language change so completely, while the blood changed so little? This is the phenomenon that geneticists and historians call language shift without blood shift, and it is one of the most powerful forces in all of human history. It does not require that one population replace another. It only requires that one population hold the power. The Spanish did not need to replace every indigenous person in Mexico to make Spanish the dominant language. They only needed to control the schools, the churches, the government, the economy. Within 3 or 4 generations, children were growing up speaking Spanish, not because their blood had changed, but because Spanish was the language of survival, the language of food, the language of safety. But here is what language cannot erase. Here is what survived underneath the Spanish words and the Catholic saints and the European architecture. Walk through any market in Oaxaca today, and you will hear words that have no Spanish origin. You will taste foods that have no European equivalent. You will see patterns in the textiles that encode cosmological systems older than Rome. The tamale that every Mexican family makes for celebrations is not a Spanish invention. It is a direct continuation of a food tradition that is at least 3,000 years old. The Day of the Dead, which the entire world now knows and celebrates, is not a Catholic holiday wearing indigenous clothing. It is an indigenous ceremony wearing Catholic clothing. There is a profound difference, and the DNA knows which one came first. That is the percentage of modern Mexicans who carry at least one indigenous American maternal lineage in their DNA. 94%. Think about what that means. You can walk through the most European-looking neighborhood in Mexico City. You can sit in a restaurant where everyone is speaking Spanish and eating food that looks completely Mediterranean and listening to music that sounds completely modern. And statistically, almost every single person in that room carries inside their cells a direct, unbroken biological connection to a woman who lived in this land before a single European ship ever crossed the Atlantic. Before Cortés, before Columbus, before any of it. That woman has no name in any history book. No statue was built for her. No holiday celebrates her memory. But she is there, in the mitochondria of her descendants, whispering across the centuries in a language that requires no words, only a laboratory, and the patience to listen. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Because when scientists began mapping not just the haplogroups, but the specific subgroups within the indigenous American maternal lineages of Mexico, they found something that shattered even the most sophisticated genetic models they had built. They expected to find a relatively uniform distribution of the founding American haplogroups across the country. What they found instead was a mosaic so complex and so regionally specific that it suggested something extraordinary about the ancient history of human movement within Mexico itself. Different regions of Mexico carry dramatically different maternal genetic signatures, not just slightly different, dramatically different. The women of the Yucatan carry maternal lineages that cluster most closely with ancient populations of the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean lowlands. The women of the Oaxacan highlands carry lineages that appear to have been isolated in those mountains for so long that they have developed unique genetic variants found nowhere else on Earth. The women of the northern desert regions carry lineages that connect them more closely to the indigenous populations of what is now the American Southwest than to the populations of central Mexico. And the women of the Pacific coastal regions carry maternal signatures that have puzzled geneticists for years because they show traces of genetic connection to populations that appear to have arrived by sea rather than by land. By sea. This is the moment in the genetic detective story where the investigator stops, sits down, and reconsiders everything they thought they knew about how the Americas were first populated. Because the standard model of American prehistory said this: people came from Asia across the land bridge of Beringia. They spread southward on foot, following the animals and the food. Everything was land-based. Everything was slow. Everything was organized from north to south in a predictable wave of expansion that geneticists call the southward migration model. But the DNA of certain coastal Mexican populations does not fit this model. It fits a different model. A model that until very recently most mainstream scientists refused to take seriously. The model of coastal migration by small watercraft along the Pacific coast of the Americas. The idea that some of the earliest Americans were not just foot travelers crossing frozen tundra, but were also coastal seafarers who could follow the kelp highway, the rich strip of ocean resources that runs continuously along the Pacific coast from Siberia all the way down to South America. And now, multiple independent genetic studies are pointing in the same direction. The Pacific coastal populations of Mexico carry genetic signals that suggest their ancestors arrived earlier than the inland populations, and they arrived by a different route. Not through the interior, along the coast, moving fast, moving by water, leaving genetic traces in the coastal communities that look subtly but measurably different from the genetic traces left by the inland migration. This is not a small detail. This is a revolution in our understanding of how the Americas were settled. And the DNA of modern Mexican women was one of the key pieces of evidence that forced scientists to take this idea seriously. Now, let us talk about something that the textbooks almost never mention. Let us talk about Africa. Because when most people think about the genetic ancestry of Mexico, they think about two populations: indigenous American and Spanish European. The colonial encounter as a two-sided story. But genetics does not recognize simple stories. And the DNA of the Mexican people carries a third major thread that is often forgotten, minimized, and sometimes actively suppressed in the national narrative. Between the years 1519 and 1829, approximately 200,000 enslaved Africans were brought to the territory of New Spain, which is modern Mexico. They came primarily from the regions of West and Central Africa. They came in chains. They came with nothing except their language and their memory and their biology. And they were forced to work in the silver mines of Zacatecas and the sugar plantations of Veracruz and the domestic service of colonial households throughout the country. And they left their DNA behind. Modern genetic studies of Mexican populations consistently find African genetic contributions ranging from 2% in highland indigenous communities to over 20% in the coastal populations of Guerrero and Veracruz, the regions where the largest concentrations of enslaved Africans were brought to work. In the town of Coajinicuilapa in Guerrero, sometimes called the first black town of Mexico, genetic studies have found African ancestry comprising more than 40% of the local population's genome. 40%. A community that was largely invisible in the official Mexican national narrative until very recently. A community whose ancestors were brought to this land in the most violent possible way, and whose genetic and cultural contribution to Mexico was systematically denied for centuries. The African maternal haplogroups found in these coastal Mexican populations, particularly haplogroup L subbranches that originate in West and Central Africa, represent some of the most recent additions to the Mexican genetic mosaic. Recent in geological time means 400 years ago. Recent enough that the genetic signal is still strong and clear and unmistakable. And what it tells us is that the story of Mexican identity cannot be told honestly without speaking the names of these African ancestors. Without acknowledging that the blood of people who were stolen from their homes on another continent flows through the veins of millions of Mexicans who may not even know this part of their own story. Because here is the paradox of colonial record-keeping. The Spanish colonial authorities kept meticulous records. They were obsessed with racial classification. They invented an entire system of racial categories called the Sistema de Castas, with dozens of specific names for every possible combination of Spanish and indigenous and African ancestry. They painted elaborate series of canvases showing each type of mixed ancestry couple and their children. They cataloged racial mixture with the obsessive precision of amateur scientists who believed that blood determined character and destiny. And yet somehow this meticulous record-keeping managed to make an entire population of 200,000 Africans and their millions of descendants largely invisible in the official story of what Mexico is and where it came from. The Sistema de Castas documented the mixture in extraordinary detail. And then the independence movement and the nation-building project that followed decided that the new Mexican identity would be built on the mythology of the mestizo, the mixture of Spanish and indigenous. African ancestry was folded into the background, erased from the official portrait, even as it continued to pulse through the veins of millions of Mexican families in the coastal communities where it was strongest. This is what genetics does. This is why the DNA does not care about the politics of national identity. The genome keeps the receipts. Every ancestor who ever contributed to a living person's biology left a mark that no political project can erase. No myth of racial purity. No selective national narrative. No burning of books. Not even the systematic renaming and reordering of an entire civilization can reach inside the nucleus of a cell and remove the evidence of who was really there. And so we return to that laboratory in Mexico City, to those scientists sitting in silence in front of their screens, because now you understand what they were looking at. They were not just looking at haplogroup charts and admixture percentages. They were looking at the full complexity of what a people actually is, not what a government declares it to be, not what a school curriculum teaches, not what a flag represents, but what the biology records with absolute indifference to human preference. They were looking at a nation built from at least 3 major founding genetic streams and dozens of regional genetic variations, all layered on top of each other across 20,000 years of human presence in this landscape. They were looking at the genetic signatures of people who crossed a frozen land bridge when mammoths still walked the earth, and people who paddled along a Pacific coastline so long ago that the memory of the journey survives only in molecules, and people who built pyramids that rivaled Egypt, and people who were conquered and enslaved, and people who were stolen from their homes in Africa and brought across an ocean in chains, and people who crossed the Atlantic voluntarily seeking fortune and power. All of them. Every single one of them. present simultaneously in the living population of a country of 130 million people going about their daily lives in the 21st century. But before we answer that question, we need to make one final stop. Because there is one more piece of the genetic puzzle that most people have never heard about. One more layer in the mosaic that will surprise you even after everything you have already learned today. Let us talk about the ghost populations. In genetics, a ghost population is a group of ancient people who left no direct descendants alive today. No living community that you can point to and say, these are their children. No culture that survived into the modern world carrying their language or their traditions. They vanished completely from the visible record of human history. And yet their DNA lives on, hidden inside the genomes of people who came after them. Absorbed through ancient mixing events so old that even the most sophisticated genetic tools can only detect them as a faint signal. Like a radio frequency from the edge of the universe, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakably there. And when scientists analyzed the deepest layers of the indigenous Mexican genome, looking beneath the haplogroups that we know and the migration patterns that we can map, they found something that stopped them completely. A genetic signal that does not match any known ancient population. A signal that is not Siberian, not East Asian, not connected to any of the recognized founding groups of the Americas. A ghost, an unknown ancestor, a population that contributed to the founding of the Americas and then disappeared so completely that we have not yet found a single skeleton or artifact or settlement that we can definitively attribute to them. Scientists have given this ghost population a placeholder name. They call it Population Y. Named after a letter because they do not yet know what to call people they cannot see. And traces of Population Y show up most strongly in certain indigenous communities of South America and in some of the oldest genetic lineages found in southern Mexico and Central America. The signal is faint but consistent. It appears in study after study conducted by independent research teams in different countries using different methodologies. And every time it appears, it points to the same conclusion. The peopling of the Americas was even more complex than we thought. There were more waves, more routes, more founding groups, more stories that we have not yet learned to read. This is the frontier of the science right now. This is where the detectives are working today. Not in the past, but in the present. In laboratories across Mexico and the United States and Europe and Japan, scientists are right now extracting ancient DNA from bones found in caves and burial sites across Mexico. They are building a picture of the ancient Mexican genome that is more detailed and more surprising with every passing year. And every new discovery seems to add complexity rather than reduce it. Every answer generates 3 new questions. Every solved mystery reveals a deeper mystery beneath it. And this is what makes the genetic history of Mexico not just scientifically fascinating, but philosophically profound. Because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Something that challenges not just Mexican national identity, but the entire human tendency to draw sharp lines around ourselves and say, we are this and they are that, and our blood is pure, and our story is simple. There is no pure blood anywhere on earth. There never was. The concept of racial or ethnic purity is not just morally wrong. It is scientifically illiterate. Every population on Earth is a mixture. Every genome is a palimpsest, a document written on top of older documents, traces of every previous text still visible beneath the surface if you know how to look. The only question is how many layers you can see and how far back you are willing to look. For Mexico, the layers go back 20,000 years. 20,000 years of human presence in this landscape. 20,000 years of people arriving and settling and building and being conquered and surviving and mixing and creating. 20,000 years of mothers passing their mitochondria to their daughters in an unbroken chain that stretches from a woman crossing a frozen land bridge when the Ice Age still gripped the northern world, all the way to a woman living in a Mexico City apartment building today, checking her phone, making coffee, completely unaware that she is the live-in endpoint of one of the longest unbroken biological chains in the human story. And here's the thing that should fill you with something very close to awe. That woman in the apartment. Her genome contains multitudes. It contains the genetic echo of the Olmec who built the first great civilization in the Western Hemisphere. It contains the whisper of Teotihuacan, that impossible city that even the Aztecs could not explain. It contains the signature of the Maya astronomers who calculated the movements of Venus to within a fraction of a degree without telescopes or computers. It contains the blood of Aztec warriors and Zapotec farmers and Mixtec goldsmiths and Maya scribes and Totonac traders and 100 other peoples whose names appear in no textbook she ever read in school. It also contains the DNA of a Spanish soldier who crossed the Atlantic in the early 1500s, seeking fortune and finding instead a civilization more sophisticated than the one he left behind. And it may contain the genetic legacy of an African man or woman who was stolen from their home on another continent and brought across an ocean in chains, and who survived that unsurvivable experience and had children, and whose children had children, and whose line continued forward through every generation of colonial violence and social erasure until it reached her kitchen this morning. She is all of these people simultaneously. Every single one of them is her ancestor. Every single one of them contributed something to the person she is today. Her immune system carries ancient adaptations developed in the highlands of Mesoamerica over thousands of years. Her metabolism reflects the agricultural revolution of corn domestication that happened in this very landscape 10,000 years ago. Her facial structure echoes faces carved in stone 2,000 years before she was born. And her capacity for language, for music, for love, for grief, for the particular way that Mexicans celebrate death and laugh at life, that capacity was shaped by every one of those ancestors together. A committee of the dead that she has never met but carries with her everywhere she goes. This is what a people is, not a race, not a bloodline, not a flag or a language or a religion. A people is a living conversation between the past and the present, a conversation carried in the most intimate possible medium, the biological code that makes each person physically possible. DNA is not a certificate of racial purity. It is a library. And the Mexican library is one of the richest and most complex and most surprising libraries that the human species has ever assembled. The scientists who made these discoveries did not diminish Mexican identity by revealing its complexity. They expanded it. They showed that the story is not smaller than the myth. It is vastly larger. The Aztec origin story that begins with a wandering tribe following a divine sign from the north is not wrong. but it is only the most recent chapter of a book that began 20,000 years earlier. And the chapters before it are just as extraordinary, just as full of courage and intelligence and suffering and survival and love. There is a Nahuatl word that has no direct equivalent in English or Spanish. The word is Nepantla. It means the space in between, the place of transition, the threshold where one thing is ending and another has not yet begun. The philosopher Gloria Ansaldúa used this word to describe the experience of people who live between cultures, between identities, between histories. People who belong fully to more than one world and are therefore sometimes made to feel they belong completely to none. For centuries, the complexity of Mexican genetic identity was experienced as Nepantla, as a source of confusion and shame and unbelonging. The colonial project tried to make indigenous ancestry something to hide. The national project tried to make African ancestry something to forget. The modern commercial project tried to flatten everything into a single exportable image of sombreros and tequila and ancient pyramids that tourists could consume without discomfort. But the DNA was always there, patient, indifferent to politics, waiting for the technology to catch up with the truth. And now the technology has caught up. And the truth is this: Mexico is not the product of a conquest. Mexico is the product of 20,000 years. The conquest was one event in a story that long predates it and continues long after it. The Spanish did not create Mexico. They added a layer to something that was already ancient and complex and extraordinary. And even the layer they added was immediately transformed by everything it touched. The Spanish language that the colonizers brought became something new in Mexican mouths. The Catholic faith that the missionaries imposed became something new in Mexican hands. The European crops that the colonizers planted became something new in Mexican soil. Everything that entered this landscape was changed by what was already here. Because what was already here was 20,000 years old and deeply, irreversibly rooted. The geneticist David Reich, who has done more than perhaps any other living scientist to map the ancient DNA of the Americas, wrote that the story of the peopling of the Americas is one of the great untold stories of human prehistory. He was right, and the DNA of the Mexican people is one of the most important chapters of that story. Because Mexico sits at the crossroads. It always has. It is the bridge between North and South America. It is the place where the Pacific and the Atlantic worlds collide. It is the landscape where the first great civilizations of the Western Hemisphere rose and fell and left their genetic fingerprints on every person who came after them. It is the land where the most violent colonial encounter in human history played out across 3 centuries, and where the survivors built something new from the wreckage that was neither fully indigenous, nor fully European, nor fully anything else